Well, it's a minute after 12, so I think we can go ahead and get started. We want to thank you all for being here. This is the last CARLA presentation of the semester. My name is Kate Paisani, and I work at CARLA. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to let you know that we will soon be announcing our spring presentation schedule. That will be out in January, and it will be on the CARLA website. Karen just put in the chat a link to that website. And I also want to mention that our presenter today, Corey Matthew, will be leading a workshop on Saturday, March 1st on secondary dual language immersion education. So if you like what you see today and you want to know more and have a more interactive experience, we encourage you to register for the workshop. Space is limited, so the sooner you can register, the better. Karen just put information about that workshop in the chat as well. So we are so happy to welcome back Corey Matthew. Corey is a longtime friend of CARLA. She's given many presentations and workshops and summer institutes for us. She is a graduate of the PhD program in multilingual education here at the University of Minnesota, and she's currently an assistant professor of multilingual education at Western Washington University. Corey also leads CARLA's Secondary Dual Language Immersion Initiative. And today she is going to be talking about some of the work for that initiative. The title of her talk is Integrating Content, Language, and Literacy in Secondary Dual Language Curriculum Materials. We will have the chat open during the talk if you want to use that to back channel. Corey will also be doing a Q&A session in the middle of the talk, and then there will be some time at the end of the talk for you to ask questions, and you can put those in the chat as well. So I will hand things over to Corey. Welcome, Corey.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you all for being here. It's so exciting to see so many folks here from around the world, and to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in the Secondary Dual Language Immersion Initiative for CARLA over the last couple of years. So for this talk today, I'm going to be covering sort of two main projects that I've been working on that are very related. To set the groundwork for that, I will start with an introduction to secondary dual language immersion and materials in general and what I mean by materials. I'll talk very briefly about the projects and the initiative, give you an overview of that, as well as give you some data from a research study that is still in progress looking at materials being used around the United States. That research study has been used to inform then the main project I'll be talking about today in terms of how do we design materials for the secondary dual language immersion context in a way that really integrates content, language, and literacy instruction in the materials themselves that teachers are using. And I'll be showing you then examples of materials that have been created for a middle school Spanish social studies unit that's not yet published on the CARLA website, but will be very soon. And I'll explain sort of our process for that and when you can expect to see those materials available as a resource for teachers and also as an exemplar, right, for those who are creating their own materials for their classrooms. As I should have introduced myself before I jumped into this. So as Kate mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Western Washington University. I was myself a high school Spanish world language teacher before I went on to my graduate studies. And I got into this idea of secondary dual language immersion because as a world language teacher, I threw out my textbook and was teaching a content-based curriculum. And it was a challenge because I was creating all my own materials. I was teaching units on climate change and the history of Panama and all these different topics that were just of interest to me and my students. And I was building all of my own materials then to be thinking about how am I teaching the content and the language at the same time. And so that's what got me very interested in the secondary dual language immersion experience and particularly how materials can better support our instruction in those classrooms. So to start off, we really have a problem with materials, and we have for decades, right? But especially as our dual language immersion programs are growing into the secondary space. When I talk about materials, there's many definitions out there, but I use a definition that I'm talking about those resources that teachers and students use in the classroom for their learning activities. And at the moment, I'm focusing on more text-based materials. They don't have to be paper, of course, but things like PowerPoints, textbooks, web-based readings. It could be a video, but handouts, worksheets, those types of things. There's other research in the world of materials that includes things like gestures and the chalkboard or whiteboard and our body language as materials, but that's not my focus for this project. Really, those tangible things that you as a teacher hold and use and bring to your students in the classroom. That's what I mean by materials. The problem with materials, with these things that we have for secondary dual language immersion, is that our teachers are consistently reporting a lack of appropriate materials that are specifically designed for dual language immersion. And they're reporting that this is a true professional challenge for them. Um, there's a couple things I want to tease apart here, right? What do we mean by appropriate? We can talk about appropriate in terms of the content that the materials are teaching or representing, as well as appropriate in terms of the language. But I also want to highlight the words I have in italics here, specifically designed for dual language immersion. We're starting to see more textbooks, more published resources that are translated into languages other than English. I'm going to use Spanish as my target language for this presentation because that's what my materials, the language my materials are in. So we're seeing more textbooks and published materials that are translated into Spanish, for example, but that doesn't mean they're designed for dual language immersion, right? A translation means that they're still just teaching content. And you're going to see this as a theme throughout my presentation today, that my argument and the work that I do shows that materials for dual language immersion need to teach both content and language and literacy. And that's what we mean by specifically designed. So the materials that teachers do use are often linguistically inappropriate for their students, meaning if they're using a translated text, it might be too easy for some students, or the translation might be poor. If they're taking a text from another country using an authentic textbook, for example, I've worked with teachers who've used Chilean textbooks in the United States, then that language level is often too high for their students. And so they have trouble then finding materials of the right linguistic level for their students. And as I've already mentioned, these materials do not integrate content, language, and literacy instruction. And so what happens is teachers have to engage in invisible work, as Amanti writes about, translating, redesigning, creating, modifying materials. And if you're a DLI teacher, I don't know how many we have in this space because you're probably teaching right now, but you'll feel this viscerally, right? The amount of time that teachers have to spend to create the materials they're going to use in their classroom. So the project that we're doing here at CARLA, and I included the link on my slide, and I believe Karen already put it in the chat, has several different components. The first I'm going to talk about today is a survey that I have put out, and I'm still collecting responses. So you'll see an opportunity to add to the survey if you teach in Spanish secondary programs or work in them. Really looking at what is being taught and what materials are being used in programs around the country. We have no data, no research data that has a broad picture of what is actually being done in secondary dual language immersion classrooms in the United States. And so this survey is designed as a first step to gather some of that data and publish it to begin that bigger conversation. The large main project of this initiative is that I am working in collaboration with teachers to create 3 mini units of content language literacy integrated materials for secondary Spanish programs. So we've created our social studies unit. That's what I'll be showing you some of today. It's been piloted by one teacher and is currently being piloted by a second one. And I meet with the second teacher next week to get their feedback. Next year, we'll be developing a science unit, and then the following year, a language arts unit. These will all be published free and available on CARLA's website. Obviously, if you or if your program has that content area, take the unit, see if you want to teach with it, modify it, whatnot. But it also serves as an example of how materials could be created that integrate content, language, and literacy in our content area classrooms. And then the third piece of the project so far is I have developed a materials use teacher self-reflection tool, and this is available on CARLA's website. And this is a tool that's designed for teachers or coaches who are working with teachers to help them think about how are they reading and processing the materials that they're using. What do they read materials for, in order to help them think about how they could better teach with those materials. I'm not going to talk about that project today, but I wanted you to know that resource is there on CARLA's website. So I'm going to transition now and give you some of the preliminary findings from this survey study. This study was important because it helped me know what content to design for the mini units, to use for the mini units, so it could be accessible to the broadest group of folks here in the United States. So far, I have 39 responses to this survey, 25 from middle schools, 8 from high schools, and 6 from programs that have both middle and high school. These are only Spanish secondary programs. We've limited it to that, as I said, because the survey was designed to inform the work being done in the mini unit development. Respondents come from 17 different states. As you can see here, the states in purple are states from where folks have responded. It's about 30% of the United States. I would love to get respondents from more states, particularly those on the East Coast that are a little less represented. And so, like I said, there'll be an opportunity where you can pick up the link and share it out with your colleagues or complete the survey yourself. The survey has several main areas. I'm not going to present data from all of these areas today. First, I wanted to know what subject areas and topics are being taught in programs across the country. So I focused specifically on language arts, social studies, and science, because those were the units that I'm creating. But I wanted to have an idea of what are you teaching in social studies? What are you teaching in science, if you're teaching that in your programs? And then, of course, I was interested in what materials are being used in the classes and what are educators' experiences with those materials. And so that's some of the data I'll be showing you now. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because my goal here is really just to lay the groundwork to show how teachers are experiencing materials in their spaces and why the work that I'm doing is important. So the first question that is of interest to me was, or the first item from the survey said, it is easy to find Spanish language textbooks for the content included in our Spanish secondary program. And you can see in each of these slides, responses will be divided by those who had social studies programs, science programs, and then language arts programs. You'll also notice that the number of the respondents aren't the same for each of the program models, because most of the programs had language arts. We have the most responses here. The fewest amount of programs had science. And so we're not comparing necessarily the same numbers across the different content areas. And that's fine for the work that I'm doing here. As you can see, in all 3 content areas, there's a high level of disagreement that it's easy to find Spanish language textbooks for the content of these programs. The next question asked, it is easy to find Spanish language textbooks that are appropriate for the Spanish language proficiency of our students, right? I wanted to see broadly across the country if that previous research is supported by what teachers are still experiencing now. And across the board, across all content areas, programs are telling us it is not easy to find Spanish language textbooks that match the Spanish language proficiency of their students. We could dive into this with lots of follow-up questions, right? That wasn't exactly what the survey was doing. I was just getting a broad understanding. The next question is, the textbooks that our program uses help me or the teachers know how to teach content. So really, that's the crux of these textbooks or these materials, right? That they should at least be teaching the content of the content areas. Oops. And we see higher agreement there, especially in social studies and science, although still a lot of disagreement. And language arts, my language arts teachers, they're just not happy with the published materials that are offered to them. And if you're working in schools right now, that's not a surprise, right? But I did think it was interesting that it's so distinct from the social studies or the science teachers. Now, the next question, again, probably not a surprise, is if the textbooks that the program uses help the teachers know how to teach language. And across the board, incredibly strong disagreement. So this really reinforces the argument that I'm making here that the materials that are being used in dual language immersion programs in the secondary level are not helping teachers teach language. And we need to continue to teach language explicitly in dual language programs in the secondary level. And we have lots of research that supports that need. The next question was just in general, I'm satisfied with the textbooks and materials that are used. And in general, folks are not terribly satisfied with the textbooks and materials. Again, this is not a surprise. As I started at the beginning, I was a teacher who threw out my textbooks and materials. I was unsatisfied with what was offered to me as a teacher. So I'm not surprised at all, but it's important to have this data for us to really push the conversation forward of how we can better support our teachers in their instructional spaces. The last question that I'm going to report just here, which I think is sobering and important for us to keep in mind, was if you are a teacher, how much time in a week do you estimate that you spend creating or adapting materials for your units or your lessons? And all of those who responded as teachers indicated they're spending at least 2 to 5 hours, if not 6+ hours a week, creating and adapting materials. So there's a real urgent need here that we know, and you know if you're working in schools, but again, we need data to prove this, right? In order to really be pushing a conversation forward and being able to back up that conversation to know that we need to have some change in these systems. So, as I've mentioned, I am still collecting responses to this survey. This tiny URL will take you to a link to the survey. You can use the QR code as well, although you might find it's easier to do on a computer than on your phone. It takes about 10 minutes to complete. If you are working in a secondary Spanish immersion context in the United States, you could be a teacher, that'd be wonderful. You could be an instructional coach, a principal, a district level person. I would love to hear your responses to this survey to even further broaden the reach of the data that I have before I go ahead and publish it. I ask that you not do this right now, of course. Write down that tiny URL, set it aside so that you don't completely lose out on the rest of the presentation. But I also ask that if you have contact with districts or folks, if you want to pass this along to friends and teachers that you know, again, in the United States who are teaching in secondary Spanish dual language context, dual language or immersion contexts, that would be greatly appreciated. Now, Kate mentioned I'm going to do a short question and answer. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, also give you a little time to write down that link if you want to, and see if there's any questions or brief comments, reactions to the data that I've shown before I move into the so what. What are we going to do about this? Oh, sorry. So you can type your comment. If you have a question or a comment, you can type it into the chat. As I said, I'm going to wait just a moment and then I'll keep on moving if there isn't any feedback or questions right now.
So nothing's coming in, Corey. I think we can probably move on if you're ready.
Okay, sure. So what? Well, we need better materials. That's an obvious so what to this. And or teachers need support in knowing how to design the materials that will help them teach content while they teach language. And so I think of this in two directions. I would love to be able to move publishing companies to create materials that are content language literacy integrated. Maybe down the line in my career, that's where I'll be able to head with this research. In the meantime, we know teachers are modifying and creating materials I want to give them some resources, some ideas for how they can do so in a way that those materials will then help them teach language in the classroom. And so the theoretical framework, or the concepts that I use when I'm thinking about this work, is as though materials are actors in the classroom. And we have lots of research showing that the materials that we use prompt us to use them in certain ways. I'm sure all of you have experienced this in some way, even if you haven't thought of it. But the design of the materials, the way that things are organized on the page or on the slide, the ways that activities are organized, again, on the page, if that's the case, the questions that are asked of students on the material prompt us and our students to engage in certain ways in the classroom. We have, as teachers, of course, have agency to use a material however we choose. But research has shown that these materials wield a very, I would say, almost surprisingly high power and even authority in the classroom, and that both teachers and students tend to defer to what is on the material in the moment of instruction. And some of you maybe have experienced this, where you have a handout or a worksheet and then you try to do something different with it. And oftentimes it feels clunky, or the students can't quite follow because they have the worksheet telling them to do something else. Or even for myself, when I'm teaching now, when I teach, PowerPoints are typically my material. And if the animation isn't quite what I expected, it can throw me off a little bit, right? Because I'm beholden then to whatever is shown on that slide in terms of how I'm presenting the content or the activity I want students to do. So that's sort of what I'm referring to. You can probably think of moments where you've had that. We can see this, like, here's a social studies middle school page, a worksheet on latitude and longitude. I could pick this up as a teacher or even as a student who's been socialized into school, and I know exactly what to do. I'm going to look at this picture and I'm going to fill in words on this on these sentences. If I, as a teacher, try to make this a really collaborative activity, for example, chances are my students aren't going to collaborate. There's nothing here on the material that makes them collaborate. It's just a simple fill in the blank. Vice versa, if I show you this material, even if you don't speak Spanish, you have some idea what to do. You know that it's a table, there's some type of comparison happening between document A and document B, and you, as a student who's been socialized into school, or as a teacher, know how to teach with this material. If we try to do something else different with it that's not about comparing document A and document B, it's going to get clunky. That's the idea. And so what does this have to do with dual language in particular? If the materials only prompt a focus on content, then teachers have to do intentional cognitive and literally physical work to integrate language and literacy into that material. And so the big question of my work is, what happens then when the materials prompt a focus on language as well? Can we design DLI materials that prompt a focus on language and literacy that are then educative for teachers, meaning when teachers use those materials, they get new ideas, they understand better how language and literacy are integrated with their content, and maybe they learn new strategies for how to teach language within their content area. Again, not saying materials are a panacea that will solve this problem, but could they be a resource that helps benefit us? And so one other way to explain this before I get into the nitty gritty of what does this look like is I think of this work as integrating three different ideas together. The first is that secondary DLI teachers are typically undertrained for content and language integration. I'm purposely using the word undertrained because there can be some training in our teacher education programs for them, but in many states around the country, secondary DLI teachers don't need a specific license or endorsement. They just happen to be bilingual and they're really strong in their content areas, but may not have had any training or only a little training in language instruction or literacy instruction in their content areas. So that's sort of strand one. That's another problem. We also know they spend too much time creating, translating, or modifying materials. We've talked about that. And we know from research that pedagogical materials have the potential to support teachers to do new things in the classroom. So if we put all those pieces together, What if the materials are designed to train the teacher? And I use that word in quotes. I don't love that word, but if we're talking about undertrained, right? What if the materials are designed to train the teacher on content and language integration while they're being used in the classroom? And those are the types of materials I'm developing here for the CARLA project. So I'm using 4 main design principles to develop these materials. These are sort of fundamental for what a teacher could take away from this talk and use in their own classrooms. You're designing materials for your classes next week. Why not try to embed one of these design principles to see if it helps you and your students then focus on language while you're teaching content? These design principles are not brand new. Some of you might be like, oh, this is kind of makes sense, or I've seen this before in other content areas, but they haven't all been put together in this way. So the first is that if you have objectives or essential questions about content on your material, we should also have objectives or essential questions that relate to language written on the material itself. And this is important because you as a teacher can have an idea. I'm going to talk about language. We're going to do a noticing activity. But if it's not there on the material, your students might not buy into it as much, right? The material has that authority, unfortunately, once it's in front of them. So what might this look like? Things like, what language does the author use to express their point of view in this seemingly neutral text, right? You've given them a handout that has a science explanation on it. Well, maybe we're also going to look for the author's point of view in this text. Or I can use my knowledge of past tense to understand an explanation of what happened. We have a history material that has an explanation of an event in the past. Rather than just focusing on the content of it, let's from the top of that material prompt that we're also going to focus on language. The second design principle are typographic enhancements of the language features in the material itself. So bolding the feature, using color, italicizing or underline a specific language feature that you want students to be focusing on. Again, by having it already there in the material, it helps you as the teacher remember to use it, to think about it, to talk about language as you're teaching the content. We can also look for language-focused tasks or questions to be written on the material itself. So we've got a history lesson about Richard Nixon, and we have a content question, what caused him to resign? Well, what language in the text helped you to answer this question? Back and forth, content language on the material itself, that in the questions that students are answering. List the effects of climate change based on their likelihood to occur. What words does the author use to indicate this likelihood? So we have a reading comprehension question and then a language focused question, again, embedded together on the material, whether it's a worksheet or a PowerPoint or, a Google Doc, whatever it might be. And then the last design principle are language focused applications. So when students are demonstrating or applying their understanding of the content, include an explicit prompt for language. So maybe students have been learning about geographic features in the Twin Cities, and in the end, they're going to create a guide for visiting geographers to explain these features. And they're prompted to try to use complex sentences to show cause and effect. Now, what I'm showing here, right, these are the materials. This isn't a unit that I'm giving you. So obviously, in this case, we'll have taught what complex sentences are before we're expecting students to use them. But I'm showing you the ways that we can embed this into the material itself. What do these design principles look like in practice? Well, here's one example. So this is in English. All the rest of my materials are going to be in Spanish for the rest of this presentation. But here's an example of a history lesson about Athens and democracy. You can notice the essential questions at the top of this page. This is a middle school material, right? So this is something that would be given to middle schoolers to work on, maybe independently or with a partner or whatever it might be. Hopefully you're noticing the typographic enhancements. There's a certain clause, right, that's being enhanced in purple on this material. And then on the second side, we have our content questions, our comprehension questions. And question 3 and 4, we notice are language focused. What do you notice about those phrases in purple? How do those purple phrases help you answer a question? And then we have our application. Write a paragraph summarizing the key factors, use the phrase by ing. So my goal here is for you to imagine if you're a teacher who's designing worksheets for your students already, it's not that much additional work at that point to add in the language prompts in the moment. With these language prompts on this worksheet, I, as a teacher, am more likely to talk about language with my students, to talk about these ing phrases and how they function, what they mean. If I don't embed those language prompts into this material and I'm a social studies teacher, I'm going to focus on the content, right? I don't have those reminders to help me focus on the language and literacy, even if I have the best intentions to do so in the moment. That's the idea here. So with all of this foundation, I want to introduce you to the unit that we've developed that will be available. The whole unit will be available on the CARLA website shortly, within the next month or so. So this unit is a Spanish social studies unit at the middle school level, and it's about understanding local and national political interests. We developed this unit prior to the election. One of my pilot teachers taught it prior to the election, and the other one actually taught it after the election. And I bring that up intentionally because this is not about the election per se, and it can be taught in non-election years. Obviously, it was very timely with it being an election year, but we're working to ensure that it can be taught in non-election years as well. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague Curtis Larson, who is a middle school social studies teacher, Spanish social studies teacher, and helped me design this unit with that social studies lens. So the theme is understanding local and national political interests. Our essential question is, in what ways do political parties represent their constituents' interests, and in what ways do they not represent their constituents' interests? And so the social studies content here is understanding what are political interests and being able to compare party political interests to the interests of the people, of the community. We had two main content objectives that students could use survey data to do that comparison of political interests of the community with those of the parties, and being able to evaluate diverse perspectives about a current event in the community. And we have two language objectives in this unit. So students are able to write complex sentences using the if past conditional structure. And then they can report the results of a survey using long noun groups. So two different language foci that are embedded throughout the unit. I do want to mention that this unit is standards-based. It's grounded in Minnesota social studies standards, as well as some national civic standards. And the standards could be modified, right? If you don't teach in Minnesota and you want to pick up this unit, of course, you can make modifications and figure out how it matches the standards of your state or your context. This is not designed to be prescriptive. It's not a scripted curriculum, but it's designed to give you lots of materials that you can use as makes sense in your context. There were two summative assessments, or there are. Students write a formal report where they summarize the political interests of their community based on a class survey. So they build and complete a survey about their community's interests. And then they also create a blog or a vlog that's written to a state political party, comparing the survey results with that party's political platform. And then there's formative assessments built throughout. So I do want to point out, because this is a stretch for some teachers, that the language structures that are those language objectives are being assessed in the social studies classroom as part of this unit. So on the rubrics for the two summative assessments, we have built in the language structure itself. Here is that C or if plus subjunctive and conditional. Here we have the long noun groups built into the rubric. And so the idea is true content language integration being assessed by the social studies teacher in this case. I wanted to give you just a brief overview of how this unit runs, and then we'll look at some of the slides. And so the way the unit runs is, of course, we're first building knowledge of political interests, political issues that are commonly being talked about at whatever context or year that we're in. Students look at the platforms of different political parties translated into Spanish. And then they look at political issue surveys. Why do we do surveys? What are or polls, right? What are these polls for? They create and administer a survey based about political issues that they give to the community. They then do some work deconstructing the genre of a survey report based on the teaching learning cycle and genre pedagogy. They look at the structure of the report and the features of a report. They analyze the survey data together in class, they write their survey reports, and then they prepare for and create their blogs, so the analysis summative. So it's really a hands-on unit where students are building a survey, going out into the community, asking the questions of folks in their community, bringing that data back into their classroom, and then doing comparisons between what are the interests of our community and what are the interests of the political parties in our state or city, or well, we kept at the state level. So you can see how this could be modified for many different contexts. So looking at some of the slides now. And again, these are slides, I'm pulling slides from throughout this unit. There's about 95 slides or so in the slide deck, along with all the ancillary materials, the worksheets, the rubrics, anything else that a teacher would need to teach this unit. So I want to show some examples of how we embedded this if subjunctive conditional phrase throughout the unit. And it starts in day one of the unit. So day one of the unit, students are shown some sentences of folks thinking, if I were president, I would lower sales taxes, or if I were president, I would protect the environment, right? Starting to see this structure of if I were, I would. They talk about these sentences. Do they agree, disagree? Later on in that day, they're shown these sentences again with some color coding. So you see that typographic enhancement. And I want you to notice this, it's a Google slide deck. And what we've done is we've built teacher notes into the comments of the slide deck to help give the teacher some ideas of how might you teach this, right? There's that educative piece. It's not the same as a published, full teacher's curriculum guide, but it provides some guidance for the teacher of kind of what we were envisioning as we created this and different ways they might go about teaching it. So in this case, we give the teacher a prompt that they could ask students, what do you notice in these sentences? There's then another activity where the teacher is working with the students to explicitly do some conjugations to make sure they understand how are we forming the verbs in this complex sentence. And then we suggest that they ask students to work with a partner to briefly write a sentence using one verb from each column, right? Trying to see, can they create these complex sentences? If you're familiar with the CAPA model of by D. Tedek and Roy Lister, you'll see this model being used, in this case, very quickly in one lesson of awareness and practice. But we also spread it out over the entire unit. So this is building into an activity where students then are working in small groups to share their own opinions. If I were president, well, the question says, if you were president, what is something that you would change in your community, your state, or the whole country? And so students are now using this structure orally, building oracy before they're expected to use it way down the line in the summative. And we have activities throughout where we then return to the structure over and over. We give teachers and students sentence stems and conversation guides, right? Remember, we're in day one of the unit to help them use these structures and lots and lots of supports, right? But then we repeat this structure, as I said, over and over throughout the unit. So later on in an exit ticket, we asked the students to think about, if you were going to write an election survey, what is one question that you would include? Exact same structure, somewhat different context, like way later in the unit. Or for a warm-up, if you participated in our survey, what would you want us to do with the collected information? And then there's the response, if I participate in the survey, I would want. So again, just reinforcing this structure throughout the unit. And one question on the survey itself has the structure as well. That was intentional. So one question that's asked of folks in the community is, if you had to pick a candidate based on just one issue, right? If you were going to be a single issue voter, what issue would it be? So again, using that exact same structure again to prepare students to use it in the summative. I want to point out that all of these activities have been content-based. They're about the social studies content. We're not throwing out the content to focus just on language. We're embedding the language within the content activities themselves. And then my last 10 minutes here before I'll stop for conversation and discussion, I want to show also how we're preparing students to do this summative of the survey report. So, right, they've gone out, they've collected data, they bring it together, they analyze it as a class, and they're expected to write a report of that survey, not an opinion, but just reporting what's there. And we have activities that guide that guide students into the deconstructing the genre of a survey report and then reconstructing it following the teaching learning cycle. So what we do is we give students an example survey report. I'm purposefully going quickly in the sense that you don't need to read the whole thing, and if you don't speak Spanish, it's fine. This is a fake survey or a fake poll of would you prefer Simone Biles or Snoop Dogg to be the president. I created this during the Olympics. If you watch the Olympics in the US, you saw Simone Biles and Snoop Dogg were two key characters in the Olympics this August. And so here's a mentor text, right? And then the teacher can ask students, what's the purpose of this type of genre? Who's the audience? What's the author trying to accomplish? What would be the effects, positive or negative, of these types of reports on the election? And then we have activities that are designed to help the teacher teach the students the structure of a survey report. So this is another activity where now the same report is color-coded. And you can see we have a lot of support here for the teacher, because this might be kind of new work for the teacher to think about structure. So the teacher in this case is being prompted to have students think about what are each of these different sentences doing? What's their function in this survey report? And we give the teacher some expected answers as well to really help them teach this genre if it's something that they're not familiar with how to do this. So they're doing some deconstruction of the structure of a survey report. They then are reading an example of a survey report that was authentic text from July of 2024, and they're highlighting the sentences of that report to find the structure using the exact same words that they were using when they were deconstructing the one previously. Again, for the teacher note, we give them some ideas of what prompts might you ask. We give them a teacher guide with the answers. So trying to really support the teacher in teaching something that they maybe have not been trained in how to teach. After they've deconstructed several survey reports, then they're going to start to co-construct. And so we have an activity with sentence strips where now students have to put together the sentences of a third survey report using what they know about how reports are structured in order to build and construct the survey report on sentence strips. This type of activity is hopefully more common in language arts classes or even Spanish world language classes. The social studies teacher may have never done something like this before. And so we give a lot of support for the teacher to understand how to run this activity, what they might expect in terms of what might go well, what might not go well, trying to help them feel confident in doing this type of literacy work. And then lastly, I want to show briefly how we focus on long noun phrases. So long noun phrases are a grammatical structure where you have a noun and then you have different words, usually adjectives or prepositional phrases, excuse me, that are qualifying that noun and adding more information to it. So we start with a warm-up of having students write a definition of a noun, an adjective, and a prepositional phrase for a third grader, right? Again, not what you would usually expect in social studies, but why not? They are exposed to long noun phrases constantly in the text that they read, and they need to be using long noun phrases in the text that they write. And so we need to integrate this language instruction into our social studies classes. So making sure students know what's a noun, an adjective, and a prepositional phrase. And then very similar to what we saw earlier with deconstructing the whole genre, Now we're deconstructing long noun phrases. So here we show a sentence from one of those example texts that they looked at earlier. And they're asked to notice, why is one word in green and other words in yellow? What's going on here? Starting to identify that some words are nouns and some words are other things that are adding to that noun, right? And you see a lot of teachers' notes are included, again, with the assumption that the social studies teacher might not be as confident in how to teach these language features. We break this apart even further, really helping students understand that there are other words that are qualifying the noun, adding, in this case, this says the voters from all over the country. So which voters? From all over the country, right? Really helping students see how a long noun phrase is being constructed. And then students work together to create their own long noun phrases out of the survey data that they had from their community. So if we have a noun of the participants, what information can we add about the participants in our community? Which participants? Where are they from? How many? Who are they? And maybe students will start to write things like, the majority of the younger participants from the Astor Park neighborhood agreed, blah, 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 right? So really helping them build language that they'll then use in their summative assessment. And then one last activity just to show you, and I hope you see how this is scaffolded and built over time, where students are given one more example of a survey report with some nouns highlighted, and they're asked to work in groups to build out long noun phrases. So now really thinking about how does this work in a whole paragraph, not just creating individual sentences. All of this work, of course, is designed to help students write their survey report with more precise language, with more complex language, as they're thinking about the social studies content in the survey report that they write. So that's some examples of what's in this unit. There's lots of other activities that are more social studies focused. If you're looking at this and you're a social studies person and you're like, well, it's all language, that's not the case. I'm just showing you those slides, those activities. As I said, I've had one teacher pilot it so far, and I'm meeting with the other one on Tuesday. I had hoped for them both to be done by the time I did this talk, so I'd have a little more information for you, but things don't always go as planned in the schools, as we all know. But I did have some very interesting feedback from the first piloting teacher. And this teacher shared that they really enjoyed the project-based nature of the unit from a social studies perspective. They thought it was a very successful, engaging unit in that way. They attempted those initial language-focused activities that I showed you, those first activities, the first day, they attempted them, and they reported that students really struggled to produce that if-then structure. This was, I believe, in a 7th grade social studies classroom. And then, interestingly, they skipped the rest of the language-focused activities, including the entire survey report that I just introduced to you. And they did the blog vlog summative assessment without the language supports. And they reported feeling frustrated that that they needed to do such high amounts of scaffolding. Not that they were frustrated that they had to scaffold, but that they just really felt like the students didn't understand how to do the assignment. And so when I work with the teachers, I tell them, that they have free reign to do whatever they want. I'm not expecting them to teach the materials with fidelity, because part of what I'm interested in is, why are the materials not working? Why did you make choices to skip things? And so I do really want to better understand, why did this teacher skip all of those language focused sections? I wasn't surprised. I've seen this before in my previous research working with teachers, but I think it's a very important piece for future research and to dive into further. And I'm very interested on Tuesday to learn how the second teacher experienced these language focused activities in the work that they did. So there's still more to come with this in terms of what happened with all this language work being skipped. And I look forward to being able to present that in the future as well. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd love to hear questions, reactions, any aha moments that you had as an educator or someone working in dual language, looking at these materials. And then, of course, my reminder, I'm still collecting responses for the survey. So if you haven't, please write that down. I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts on this work.
Thanks so much, Corey. I always love hearing you speak because you do such a good job of laying out the research and then connecting it to practical things. And it resonates so well with what I'm interested in and what we do at CARLA. So thank you so much for the presentation. There is a question in the chat from Lorena who asks about what you're focusing on in the materials. So here's the question. When it comes to materials, do you focus solely on content and language, or do you include cultural aspects? And if so, how do you decide which ones to include? And I think this is related to a larger question of how we define content, right? What is the content that we're teaching to our students?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So for this unit, as you saw, we were really focusing on these social studies standards related to political interests, um, and comparing local and national political interests. That was the standard that we were focusing on. We did not include culture embedded into this unit. I did get feedback, although I will say when I worked with the teachers, the piloting teachers, I was very explicit to say, add things as you want, especially related to your local communities, right? This unit, like I said, the first teacher taught this prior to the election. It was obviously a very high tense time in our world, in our country here in the United States. And so I recommended, right, that the teacher make adjustments that would match their students. They shared with me some of the adjustments that they made. So I could see in this unit how one could go on a slight tangent about when you're looking at which issues are most important to our community, how does that relate to the cultures represented in our community? Most definitely. We didn't include it here particularly because that's so locally context specific, right? And I do think though for any unit that you're teaching, that you can embed connections to your local community and your local cultures to see how those cultures are connecting to the content that you're teaching. I just chose to focus on the state standards as my guiding force and then leaving that open to teachers to add as they see fit based on where they're teaching. It's especially hard when you're making materials that are going to be shared with the whole country, right? Like the cultures across our country, even among groups that would have the same sort of ethnic name, are going to be different. So I think that should be something that's embedded locally.
There's actually a really interesting and related question that just came in from Janice, and they asked, have you encountered content and materials from other countries that have different perspectives than how, oops, sorry, things are moving around, that have different perspectives than how that content is typically taught in US schools? I'm thinking about history in particular, whose stories are being told and how do schools address this?
That's a great question, Janice. And personally, with the work that I've done with teachers, like I mentioned, working with a teacher who used a Chilean textbook, that teacher was teaching world history and happened to use the Chilean textbook. There were parts of the textbook that he didn't use because it was specific to Chilean history and the Chilean perspective of world history. And so that teacher chose not to use those sections. And to be very frank, I'm not a history teacher, and so I'm not as familiar with how ancient Greece would be taught in the US versus how it's taught in Chile. And so in that context, I didn't see anything specific. I think certainly one would find different perspectives. And I should say I've looked at Mexican textbooks that have very different perspectives, right? And I think that's fantastic. I think we should bring those in and talk about, we could even compare a Pearson textbook in English, like a couple paragraphs to the Mexican textbook in Spanish that are talking about the same topic and talk about why do they look different? Why are different things being chosen to be shared? I think that that's an important way that we can bring in some more critical thinking and critical literacy into our classrooms.
So we have a question related to language now. We've talked a little about content. We can talk about language. So this is from Liliana, who, in addition to complimenting your session, asks, could you please offer some recommendations about scope and sequence for language features and grammar that we should be concentrating on? And that's a big question,
It's
right?
the question that I'm
Yeah.
always asked. If anyone out there knows of a wonderful published, language scope and sequence, I'd love to see it. Common Core State Standards in Spanish, right? Translate into Spanish, have some scope and sequence there in terms of some literacy features and some language features. Vida Marco Dale is, and I'll actually put it in the chat so that you know what I'm talking about. Vida Marco Dale is Spanish language, a Spanish language development framework related, very similar to the WIDA English language development framework. So that provides some resources for thinking about what language might you target in different content areas. I think it's fantastic as a resource. I don't think it's the end all and be all though. I think, frankly, the challenge sometimes is that the language that you target should make perfect sense with the summative you're asking students to do, right? So you as a program could even lay out your summatives across the year, horizontally and vertically. I lay out all of your summatives, think about what genres are those summatives, what are we asking students to do in terms of genre, and so then what language features make sense to relate to those summatives. And you might actually see then that you got to move some of those genres around because we're asking them to analyze before we've ever asked them to inform, right? So that's a big task, but that's one thing that I would recommend, again, doing that work locally and using Vida Marco Dale as a resource as you're doing that.
Okay, we have another language related question. So this is from Lorena. And the question is, when it comes to vocabulary, do you find yourself making adjustments depending on the audience, or do you try to use a general, more standard, in quotes, version of certain words? I ask mainly because in Spanish, there's a lot of variety in words and what they can mean, depending on the country, like avocado, and there's a couple of
Yep,
different
exactly.
varieties for saying avocado. Yeah.
Yeah, so we want to expose our students to that variety. We want them to know that there's language variety out there, that all of these words are correct and honored and valued. And so we can do this by having texts from different countries that show that language variety. If you teach in a context where your students come from or have heritage connections to different varieties of Spanish, you can certainly use your students as resources, right? We're reading a text that says aguacate, and then we can say, does anyone else know a different word for this, right? And really honor and teach that variety in the classroom. That's my simple answer to that.
So there aren't any more questions in the chat, but there is an aha moment that I want to share because especially in light of the feedback that you shared from the piloting teacher, I think this is relevant for that. So this comes from Debbie, and they say, I appreciate the feedback because it gave me a feeling of solidarity with student frustration with activities that require high levels of scaffolding. I teach 7th and 8th grade history, and students are very eager to engage with identity politics, but sometimes struggle to articulate their thoughts in the target language. Breaking down long phrases will highly benefit my students to empower them with content that connects to their real life.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. And I'm so happy to hear that. And once this is published, take the ideas and apply them to a different unit, even if you need to, right? I also want to share, I know some folks have already left, but my email is here. Please feel free to reach out to me. If you're a teacher and you're like, hey, I'm working on this unit, do you want some feedback? Or you want to brainstorm something for your program, I would love to be a resource and help with that. There's so few of us working on secondary programs, and it can be so isolating. And so I really encourage you, if you want to reach out to me over email and continue the conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Corey, again, for your presentation and for your thoughtful responses to people's questions and feedback. And thank you, everybody, for attending today and for your questions. We hope that we will see you next semester during the CARLA presentation series. And we wish you all happy holidays and a wonderful break when that comes for you. So take care, everybody. Have a good day.